Ecosystem after system is plundered and laid to waste as from the earth he sucks the life.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
John Seed.
And John, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for doing this. And my standard first question is to ask what's currently preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting, worrying you? What's happening?
Well, I guess a bit of context is that for nearly 40 years now, I've been working in both the conservation of nature and in the eco-philosophy, I suppose, eco-psychology space. Mm-hmm. And in the last few years, there's been a tremendous upsurge of interest in the deep ecology workshops that I've been facilitating all of that time, ever since I first developed them with an American teacher, Joanna Macy. And for 30 years, although there were lots of people that would attend, they were mostly like hippies, pagans, witches, and environmentalists. And then in the last few years, the workshops have been filling up, and there are professors and last month a senator and IT professionals and public servants. And so I've started training more people to facilitate this work. And I've started developing some new forms. Melbourne in Australia is the place in the world where this is the most, where there's the largest constituency of people that are excited by this. So I just spent 10 days in Melbourne doing 2 weekend workshops and 6 presentations in different venues in between. So what's interesting me is how to move the experiential deep ecology workshops from being a kind of a workshop with a facilitator that you pay in order to do this work into more of a cultural phenomenon that, to me, these workshops are synchronous with the kinds of ceremonies that all Indigenous societies have practiced since, I don't know, I suppose that it's since human beings became human beings. And all these societies have ceremonies where the community stops its normal day-to-day activity many times throughout the year and focuses on honouring the web of life and remembering that we are part of that web. You know, whatever's going on the rest of the time in terms of social kind of things, we put that down and we remember all our relations. And so I've been trying to think about how to move the work that I've been doing beyond just being a workshop. And so when I was in Melbourne last week, I had the second of what we're calling deepenings, which are basically the same as the experiential deep ecology work, which I can describe later if you like. It's the same as what Joanna Macy now calls the spiral of the work that reconnecting us to the more than human world. But the deepenings are free, and they're by invitation, and the invitation goes to people who have had some experience with deep ecology, who have attended at least one deep ecology workshop. And the idea is once a person has done one workshop, they don't need to pay for any more, because from now on, we're going to have regular weekends throughout the year where these things are just freely available. And so we just had the second one of those. And because there are now close to 500 alumni of deep ecology workshops in Melbourne, that's where I'm focusing on, because that's the heart of where the interest lies.
And I'm wondering, John, if you could tell us how we might account for this shift in people involved in the workshops, from people leading, in inverted commas, alternative lifestyles, who are probably still involved, to people leading very conventional lifestyles, a senator, civil servants and so on. Because did that come as a shock to you? Was it gradual, and how did it happen?
I guess I'd grown used to the constituency, and so it was somewhat of a surprise.
Yeah.
Especially, there are probably now maybe up to a quarter of the people in each workshops are now from the psychotherapy, counselling space. So that it does appear that something interesting is taking place, and I suppose that my first thought on it is that it's because everybody is realising how serious the situation is now, and that the early adopters of the point of view that we're in serious trouble have now been joined by the broad mass of people. But I have no evidence for that. But that's just my first assumption.
And the psychological impact of the climate crisis is obviously an important part of what you do, but is clearly making sense to many other people who are professionals in the field as well.
Well, I mean, even the fact that I don't know how it is where you live, but the term climate anxiety is now the kind of thing that one reads just in the mainstream press, that this is not an esoteric or fringe kind of a thing any longer, but that people everywhere are beginning to notice that it's affecting the quality of life right now, even though it's, the weather's pretty nice where I am. I don't know what it's like in Spain, but just the threat of what the weather's going to be like for later in my life or for my children, it's beginning to impact people.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. On to the topic of deep ecology, if we could, John. I wonder if you spoke a bit earlier. It's an important philosophical current. Could you tell us about your own engagement with deep ecology, when it started, how it started, and your contributions to it?
Well, 50 years ago, I moved back to Australia after leaving my job as a systems engineer for IBM, working in the financial district in London. I came back to Australia, and I had become interested in Buddhist meditation. And so I got together with some friends and we built a meditation centre, and then a small piece of land nearby where we lived in community, growing our own food and building our own houses, delivering our own babies, and organising meditation retreats. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was going to spend my life like that when in August of 1979, I found myself suddenly embroiled in what years later we realised was the first direct action in defence of rainforest, not only in Australia but anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And I just fell into that quite accidentally. But something happened to me, when I was occupying that line between the ancient 100-million-year-old rainforest and the human project attempting to convert it into, stuff that changed everything. That I lost interest in what I'd been doing and became obsessed with protecting first this place and then other rainforests in Australia and then elsewhere. Those first years were amazingly successful. I think that the society had yet to develop any antibodies to the kinds of theatrical expressions of people climbing up into the trees or chaining themselves to machinery. But it was easy to be the first item on the news night after night, and we quickly communicated our passion and our concerns. Right. And clearly the tide was running with us, because in less than 2 years, an opinion poll found that over 70% of the people of our state of New South Wales wanted an end to rainforest logging, and the area that we had been defending became a national park, but a whole string of national parks was created at that time. And something similar happened the following year in the state of Tasmania, and then 2 years later, the tropical rainforests in far north Queensland. But at the same time, I'd started the Rainforest Information Centre and I was studying what was happening worldwide, and it became clear that in spite of our success in Australia during that first half of the 1980s, for every forest that was protected in the world, 1,000 forests had been destroyed.
Right.
And clearly there was no way to save the planet one forest at a time.
John, let me interrupt for one. I need to interrupt for 1 second. Sorry. I'm going to keep recording. I'm having a slight struggle with the podcat, Chinguri.
Yeah.
I just need to sort of sequester him. But please keep speaking. I'm just going to turn the camera off. Yeah?
Yeah.
All right. So there you are. You're realizing that while this struggle is succeeding at some level in Australia, there are so many other rainforests that need curation and care and love.
Well, that's right. The satellite photographs are showing that for every the rates of destruction are such that less than a single human lifetime remains at those rates of destruction before the rainforests are annihilated, and with them half of all of the species of plants and animals in the world. And so the question is, how is it that human beings are behaving in such a foolish and self-defeating manner as to be imagining that we can profit from the destruction of what is, after all, our own life support systems? It's like, this was the question that needed to be answered. And in looking around and reading, I found Deep Ecology, where for the first time I felt that, I was getting some answers to these questions. And so this was in about 1982 or 1983. I ran into the work of Arnie Ness, the man who coined the term deep ecology. The late Arnie Ness was professor of philosophy at Oslo University. And according to him, underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis is the illusion of separation between human beings and the more than human world. The illusion of separation might sound a bit mystical, but actually all that you have to do to understand exactly what he meant with great force is to hold your breath for 10 minutes while you think about it. And then you realize that we can call it the environment as though it's over there somewhere. But the reality is that the nature out there and the nature in here are continuous, are cycling through each other all of the time. This isn't a stretch intellectually, but we don't experience ourselves in that way. When we think about who am I, we don't include the water and the air and the soil. And you have to be a good person to defend the water, because it requires you to be altruistic. Alta is the other. So because the air and the water and soil are other than myself, then I'm a good person. I take care of things other than myself in order to protect them. But if we understood that these are part of my very self, that the idea that there could possibly be a self without the air and the water and the soil is absolutely ridiculous. That self is just a social fiction. It has no reality. So deep ecology, Arnie Ness said that this illusion of separation, which itself stems from anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the center of everything, that this is so deeply rooted in every institution of our society and in the very language that we speak and in our psyche, that he said we're not going to be able to think our way out of the mess that's been created. He said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity or ecological self. And in order to nourish that ecological identity, he called for community therapies to heal the illusion of separation, to heal our relations with the largest of all communities, that of all living beings, of the living earth. And that's what some years later, a couple of years later, when I met Joanna Macy, that's what we began to do, was to construct some of these community therapies to give some substance to Arnie Ness's call. And these are the experiential deep ecology workshops that I do in Australia, and what Joanna calls the work that reconnects, which is popular in the United States and in Europe.
Without wanting to take away from what people pay for in the workshops, could you outline them a little bit for us so that people might learn a little more about how they function?
Well, I guess the first thing to say about that is that what I've come to realize is that if there is any separation between the human and the wild nature out of which we have emerged, it's all coming from our side, that the earth never pushed us away. All of the separation is coming from our side, and that what we found is that any time a group of people gets together with the shared intention to heal that separation, that's what does all the heavy lifting. It hardly matters what you do after that. That we've tried many different things, and without hoping not to appear too arrogant or boastful, everything works because it's not about the particular process. So after that, I can tell you about the kind of processes that we use. But the important thing is that when we make a gesture of reconciliation and put a couple of days aside to do anything together with a community of people with the intention to heal that illusion of separation and to experience our participation, our embeddedness in the larger Earth community, the Earth comes rushing back in always, and for everybody that's there. So it's quite astounding the forcefulness with which this happens. So having said that, the spiral of the work that reconnects goes, we start with gratitude, and it's just important for everybody to just start in a very positive sort of frame of mind. So we have processes where people have the opportunity to share what they're grateful for, and then we move into what Joanna Macy now calls honouring our pain for the world. So this, she used to call it Despair and Empowerment when we met. That was the name of her book that she had written. And this stems from her understanding that we come from a culture in which there's a tremendous denial of certain feelings. And in particular, we're never invited to share our deepest anguish or rage or terror about what we see happening to our world, and that this is something that we have to keep hidden, and all of us have learned how to suppress these feelings. And in doing so, we're suppressing a really important part of our intelligence, and a huge amount of psychic energy is needed to hold down these instinctual energies that are pushing up and trying to inform us. You know, that I think of my non-human ancestry, and I realized that for 4,000 million years, every single one of my ancestors was intelligent enough to reach the age of reproducing itself before it was consumed. And 99.99999% of that was before we developed cognition. So what we call feelings, these feelings that are suppressed, are what remains in us of this ancient intelligence which has stood the test of time and which has been selected for in each generation, that the accuracy of these feelings to be able to let us know what is safe and what is dangerous, when to run towards something, when to run away. So Joanna taught us how to create a safe container that would allow these feelings and welcome these feelings, and that's the first station. After gratitude, we come to honouring our pain for the world, and then we move to seeing with new eyes. And the particular processes, for instance, that I was using this last weekend, as I say, this isn't what defines the work. The work is defined by the intention. But the particular processes that I'm using included the Council of All Beings, which was the first of the experiential deep ecology processes that Joanna and I created in 1986 when we met. And the Council of All Beings is a ceremony where each participant, we do a vision quest, and each participant connects with some non-human being to whom she or he is going to give voice in council. And then we make masks just out of paper plates and crayons and string. We make masks to represent that ally, and then we pass through a ceremonial portal to enter the Council of All Beings and begin to speak in the first person, I am the Milky Way, or I am mycorrhizae, or whatever it is. You don't have to believe anything, you just have to get into a playful kind of a mood, but always we hear voices that we've never heard before, like something extraordinary always emerges from that pushes us away from our normal identity and begins to stretch the boundaries of our identity. It's interesting that a couple of years after Joanna and I created this, I was facilitating workshops in the United States, and I happened to find myself at a ceremony with some Hopi Indigenous people on a mesa in the southwest, and there was just a handful of us as witnesses. Everybody else in the community was participating, and to my astonishment, I saw they were doing the Council of All Beings, which I thought that Joanna and I had just invented, but which they assured me they'd been doing for 10,000 years without a pause. And that after that, as I looked into it further, I found that I couldn't find a single example of an Indigenous community that had held on to its ceremonial life that didn't include regularly in the course of the year opportunities for people, the whole community with the children watching, to remember who we really are underneath that social veneer, which is our day-to-day, and and to honour that. So the Council of All Beings, I think one of the reasons that it's so strangely effective in moving us is because it touches on some ancient threads inside us, and this people in sharing afterwards regularly comment on this sense of uncanny familiarity that they feel when this kicks in, because even though in this life we've never gone there before. So shall I continue with perhaps, would you like to go somewhere else now?
No, a little bit more, if that's okay, would be
okay.
Great, John.
So one of the other processes that I did this last weekend is one that's called a cosmic walk. And this was created by Sister Miriam Therese McGillis, a Catholic nun from a community called Genesis Farm in New Jersey. And she was a colleague of the late Thomas Berry. Thomas Berry was a famous Catholic theologian, perhaps the most famous progressive Catholic theologian of his age, the latter half of the 20th century. And quite late in his life, Thomas had an epiphany and realized that he was now a geologian, and that his attention had turned from the kind of framing of spirituality and of God that he'd grown up with in his tradition to the earth itself as the source of everything, including all of the human ideas about spirituality and God and so on. And so then he saw that the story that he had believed in through his upbringing and his training, the creation myth of Adam and Eve, and that story was just one of 10,000 stories that exist on the earth, that every different culture has a different story when the kids say, where do we come from? What are we doing here? And Thomas said that these stories are an exquisitely beautiful expression of our humanity, but he said that they tend to be at war with each other, that the reason why we are we and they are them is because we've got a different answer to this question and we've got a different story. And he said that it's not just that the Christian story is at war with the Muslim story, but that the Catholic story is at war with the Protestant story, and the Sunni story is at war with the Shia story. And he said, it's too late for all that. We now need a story that's going to unite humankind rather than separate us. And he proposed that the story as revealed by empiricism, the story of cosmology and the story of evolution, the story that science reveals, is the only possible story that could unite all of us. Because he said, a Catholic astronomer reporting on what he sees, a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Jewish astronomer will all agree, and that's the cosmological creation myth of the Big Bang And at first there was just hydrogen and helium, and then there was galactic formation, and then there was a supernova explosion. And when that settled down, our sun ignited, etc. And then the whole story of the evolution of life on Earth, that this is something that we can all agree on. But he said we can't leave it to the scientists to tell that story because they seem to be incapable mostly of sufficient awe and wonder. And so he called on the poets and the musicians and the artists to turn the scientific story into a worthy creation myth. And many have responded to Thomas's call, and one of these was Sister Miriam. So Sister Miriam's cosmic walk goes like this, that when I went to Melbourne, I carried with me a ball of hemp that was 50 metres long, and along that ball of hemp were 23 beads appropriately placed. And I made a spiral in the middle of the room out of that ball of hemp. And at one end, in the middle of the spiral, there was a bead, and that represented the flaring forth of the universe in the first place. And the story that goes with that bead is the extraordinary fact that we need to stop and consider sometimes that anything exists at all, because the slightest variation in the the strength of gravity, or the slightest variation in the constants of physics, and nothing would exist. And so so we celebrate that, and at each of the 23 beads a tea light candle is placed. We learn a chant which is called Child of the Universe, and while we chant Child of the Universe, the youngest person walks around lighting one candle after another as we tell the story, and 2/3 of the way along, a candle is lit to represent that the supernova explosion of the grandmother star that gave rise to the sun. And quite soon afterwards, the first cell of life on Earth, and slowly this spiral of light appears. But the way that the story is told, according to Thomas, is that it's not only that we live in such a universe as is described, but rather that we are that universe at the point when the universe becomes complex enough in the human for it to be able to create this story, for it to be able to do the astronomy and to do the physics and to do all of these things that allow this story to appear. And so this is the moment when the universe has become conscious in this particular way in the human, and the universe sees herself perhaps for the first time. And we imagine the universe sort of slowly looking over its shoulder, and the jaw of the universe drops in utter astonishment to discover the trail that it's trod for these 13.7 billion years to bring us here. And when this is done in a ceremonial fashion, then once again, people's sense of identity, there's a tremendous sense of relief, especially for activists, because it's like as we light one candle, we celebrate the extinction 232 million years ago at the end of the Permian, when 95% of the species disappeared at the end of the Permian. And we rejoice in the fact that everything that we know and love radiated forth from the surviving 5% of species. And so suddenly we realized that, that this flame that got passed to us from our parents, from their parents, and so on, and that stretches back to the beginning of life, and that stretches back, every cell in my body is descended in an unbroken chain from those events, and every atom in my body is descended in an unbroken chain from that original hydrogen and helium, and then through the death throes of the first generation of stars came the carbon and the iron. And so when we make that story the story of our identity, it kind of changes everything. And people leave that particular ceremony filled with joy and hope, not because I've constructed it, because that's just what happens when you recognize that this is who you truly are. This isn't all that you truly are, because, of course, at that point, you're welcome to come back to your incarnation as a threatened mammal in 2024 and throw yourself back into the fight, But what I found is that a lot of the hysteria disappears at that point when we understand that there is this place that moth and rust doth not corrupt, that there is this place of utter safety. One of Thomas Berry's colleagues, the mathematical cosmologist Brian Swim, who wrote a book about Thomas's work called The Universe is a Green Dragon, once said that the earth used to be nothing but lava, and now it sings opera. And so when you realize that you're part of a universe where lava, without anything being added from the outside, that's what it does. It changes and it changes and it changes until it's singing opera. And that whatever happens to us and whatever happens here, this is where we've come from and this is where we go back to, and that there's nothing, that the lava that has the propensity and maybe even the desire to sing opera, that to understand that I am that, it changes everything. So anyway, that's the thing is that it has to be experienced. That like talking about it can make you want to have the experience, but the actual experience is what changes everything, and not the. I think Arnie Ness was right that the ideas aren't enough to make the necessary change, to change our behaviour, to change our values, so on.
And I wondered, John, if for a moment I could cast you back, as they say in baseball commentary on television or radio, to being a systems engineer. You were and are a person of science, very much, as well as a person of commitment and belief. Do the things that you learnt in becoming and being a systems engineer still have value for you, or was there a major epistemological rupture or break back in the 70s?
No, there was definitely a major rupture, and it was a rupture that happened to, I think there are many people looking back at the 70s who would have a similar story. That for me, it was when I made contact with LSD, and it was just the psychedelic experience changed everything. And so it's not for a while. I sort of indulged rather frequently trying to find that experience over and over again. But actually, the more that you do it, the less it works. So that there's a kind of it's not the kind of thing that you can become addicted to, because it stops working if you. So anyway, it's not something that continued, especially. And so that's kind of what led me to Buddhism, because I wanted, like there was a kind of a story about that, that the experience of psychedelics was perhaps the same as or akin to the enlightenment that, various spiritual traditions promised. And that didn't turn out to be so for me, at least. It might, maybe meditation will work like that, but it just one thing led to another. So LSD led to me leaving IBM and finding Buddhism and dropping all drugs and intoxicants and living a very pure life for a while there. And then that led me into the forest, and then that led me into deep ecology. And, so there's, I think it was Shakespeare speaks of, in one of his plays, of a tale told by an idiot, So there's no, I don't get the feeling that there's any, choreography going on or anything like that. It's just one random event seems to lead to another.
No, I understand. I like the idea of the two acronyms, IBM and LSD, both proving to be things that you left behind in favor of words existing in natural language. One thing I wanted to ask you about was other forms of Christianity, because, as you know, much of evangelical Christianity rejects the science of the origins of the earth, rejects doctrines of evolution. and argues that, God created Earth 4,000 years ago, that's that, and the indigenous notions of cosmology are out the door and so on. This is an extremely powerful force in the United States and in various parts of the Americas, displacing Catholicism in many ways and rejecting many of the notions of conservation on the grounds that whatever happens is God's will. I wonder, is that something you've encountered in your work? Do you have experience of trying to deal with that sort of resistance to both environmental science and also action?
I guess nobody from that kind of world would ever find themselves at a deep ecology workshop or a deep ecology lecture. I don't think that I'm enough of a threat to, prompt someone to come along in order to argue with me, and so I mean, where it takes me to is a question that I'm often asked is, aren't you preaching to the choir? Don't you need to be talking to the, director of ExxonMobil rather than to the kind of, because the people who come to the workshops are people who've already changed their mind. Right. And now the workshops are the promise that it can go deeper than that, and it's true. I mean, no one ever comes to something that's called the Council of All Beings for the wrong reason, because you're either going to go, oh, God, what a heap of woo-woo rubbish, or you're going to go, wow, that sounds like it might be interesting. So it's only the people to whom that could sound interesting that would ever be exposed to it.
Right.
And so that's a little bit, how to say, I'd love the world to be different. I'd love the world to be one where I could make an impact on the people who, from my point of view, are much more of a problem than, the good people who are, already concerned about the planet and, already have joined environment groups and taking action about climate and so on. But I'm a little bit comforted by the existence of there's a method of regenerating native bush that was developed by two sisters named Bradley in Sydney. It's called the Bradley method. And what they found was that if you want the original nature of a place to return, whether it's, been very severely degraded or not, then you don't need like heroic tree planting. That all that you need to do is to learn how to recognize both the natives and the exotic species, both in their mature form and when the seedlings first appear out of the ground. And the whole of the method is to remove the exotics without treading on the natives. But the reason that I bring it up in this context is that there's one further proviso, which is that the area that you're managing, there'll be some part of it that's severely damaged, that's breaking your heart, and you'll want to start there. That's what you want to fix. But if you do, you will fail. That what you have to do is you have to locate the strongest expression of native intelligence in the place. If the whole area you're managing has been mowed for a century, but there's a corner that the mower couldn't get to, and there's some annual weeds and the beginnings of a few pioneer tree species, start from there. And then you just slowly and humbly back out, pulling out the exotics, making sure that you don't damage the natives. And as you go, in every year, the area becomes larger and becomes more robust and becomes more complex. And 5 or 6 years later, suddenly perhaps the climax species begin to appear. Where did they come from? Did a bird drop the seed? Were the seeds lying dormant in the ground for 100 years? We don't know. But basically, it becomes more and more robust, and that process accelerates as time goes on. And 10 years later, as you're backing away and the area is growing more and more complex and larger, you suddenly find yourself at that original erosion gully or whatever it was that was breaking your heart at the beginning. And by now, the thing is strong enough that it takes it in its stride. And at this point, it can be repaired. So I say this because I think that the human condition, I like biological metaphors. I don't like spaceship Earth. I like metaphors that honour our biology. And so I think that then that the pernicious ideas such as the old man with a white beard that created the universe 4,000 years ago and littered it with fossils in order to deceive us, or whatever the reason was for sticking those dinosaurs in the ground. That is something that I mean, I guess it comes back to the first thing that we spoke about is how is it that it's not just hippies, pagans, witches, and environmentalists, but one of your recent podcasts with Professor Tema Milstein. She's attended one of my workshops, and now later this year she'll be co-facilitating for the third time with me, and she's bringing her graduate students along. And so it just feels as though time will tell, but it's my hope that we're witnessing something similar. It's not that we have to plant ideas in people's minds, but just when people have these experiences, the ideas emerge by themselves or something like that.
Well, John, I hope you're not suggesting that so-called dinosaur fossils are anything other than objects planted by socialists and feminists around the world to confuse the one true path of capitalism and evangelical Protestantism. Surely not. But yes, it was wonderful encountering Tema in the recording we did, and in fact, she alerted me to your work and introduced us, and I'm very grateful to her. She's a wonderful scholar, and it's exciting that her grad students are going to be working with you. I wondered, John, if you would tell us a little bit about one of your key projects. I'm assuming it's still a key thing for you, the Rainforest Information Centre.
Yeah, it is still a key. And the Rainforest Information Centre started out just as a letterhead on a sheet of paper. And it's sort of grown in, and then eventually it became a charity and, so on. But it's 40 years old now. And it's working in different parts of the world at the moment. But maybe I'd like to tell you about perhaps the most interesting project from my point of view that we're working on. Back in the late 80s, we were invited to intervene in some rainforest destruction taking place in Ecuador. We got an aerogram. I guess you're old enough to remember what that is. We got an aerogram from one Jaime Levy, a Peace Corps volunteer from the United States working with the Awa indigenous community on the Colombian border, and whose rainforest was being destroyed by colonization. And he asked for help. He must have somehow found out that we existed and that we were interested in protecting rainforests. One of our volunteers went over there and ended up living there for the next 7 years and starting. We were able to protect the Awa territory and also the Warani and the Sarayaku. And we work always with Indigenous people because it was so much stronger, like to be helping the people whose land this traditionally was, rather than just being outsiders interfering. But anyway, one of the projects that we did there was we helped to create the Los Cedros Biological Reserve in the Andes, and that is one of the highest rates of endemism in the world. It's the home to the spectacled bear and the puma and more species of butterflies than anywhere else in the world, and so on and so on. And we received a grant from the Australian government. We were having a bit of a love affair with the government in the early 80s because of they were getting very popular for saving rainforests in Australia. And they helped us to establish this biological reserve. And we've been protecting it against one threat or another ever since, while all around it, the other areas are being degraded, so that recently the professor of biology from Oregon State University, Biddy Roy, who does a lot of research over there, said it's the best forested watershed now in Western Ecuador. And it's just because we've been able to protect it from the loggers and the land developers and the colonists and the poachers and so on. But anyway, not long ago, a corrupt vice president of Ecuador, he later went to jail for corruption, but at the time he was able to bring a new law in which allowed mining in previously inaccessible to mining natural areas that were designated bosques protectores, protected forests. 2 million hectares was now open to mining. And a Canadian mining company set up at the Los Cedros Biological Reserve. We sued them. We went to court. We won. We lost. We won. Kept appealing. And then the year before last, it came up to the Supreme Court in Ecuador, which is the constitutional court. Now, Ecuador is the first country in the world whose constitution included the rights of nature. And so we used the rights of nature as our legal argument, saying that the rights of nature were being, downtrodden through this mining. And to everyone's amazement, the Constitutional Court agreed, ejected the mining company, and created this. It's the first time in the world that this has happened, that the rights of nature actually has some legal standing somewhere. And human rights was in the same position only 100 years ago. Human rights was just as unlikely a prospect 100 years ago as the rights of nature are today. And now human rights is, everyone thinks we've always had human rights. So anyway, that's just really exciting. And we've been raising funds this year for supporting several other court cases where natural areas are attempting to protect themselves from mining companies using the precedent that we created.
That's fantastic. And of course, there is an emerging body of science about the way other animals think that is assisting in the generation of a legal doctrine of animal rights. It's proving, if anything, tougher, but it's out there. And there are law cases being set up, as you're well aware, to protect our fellow animals from us and from their enslavement by us. And these developments, I think, are enormously exciting. John, you mentioned earlier a flirtation by the Australian government with the Rainforest Information Centre in the 80s because of actions it had taken to protect the Daintree and so on. What's your experience been of the political process in terms of this being an area where, as you've explained with reference to Ecuador, on the one hand, there can be enormously positive developments. On the other, there can be corruption, and not just literal financial corruption, but the corruption of, to reuse a word I just deployed positively, development, where there is this desire for increases in gross domestic product, greater wealth, and so on. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your experience of politics in that sense.
Well, mostly it's been a bad experience. Like today, the politics in Australia is in such bad shape, in that, as in the United States and as in many parts of the world, things seem to be drifting off with, to me, it looks like madness on the left as well as madness on the right. And the madness on the left is more painful because that's kind of where I've sort of felt my tribe to be, and so it's harder for me to tolerate. And but I'm old enough now to have seen things change. That like I was a teenager in the 1950s, and I have to say there was nothing about the 1950s that would have led one to anticipate the 1960s. And that there just seem to be these waves in the affairs of human beings. And so I think, one needs to be ready to make political moves at those times when political moves are going to actually move things along, because I've seen people who've wasted decades of their lives trying to do political things when politics was just really not going to budge. And but I'm just reminded of an interesting political lesson that I learned very, very early on in my conservation career. It was in 1979. In August, we started blockading Terania Creek. And in October, only 2 months later, we were still just a couple of hundred hippies against the world. And we received an invitation from the Premier, which is like the governor of our state of New South Wales, Neville Wran, to come and visit him in his office in Sydney in Parliament. And we were stunned, and we went down there, three of us, and we went into his office, and there was all media in the foyer. And we hadn't invited them. What were they doing there? And they were all stunned. Why was the Premier seeing these people? And we went in, and Neville Wran was there, and he just chatted for like an hour. He gave us cups of tea, and he talked about his love of nature, about his love of the bush, about his relationship with a particular conservationist who had changed things, his understanding of the world and so on. And we were like, why are we here? What's going on? And at the end he said, I suppose you've come here because you want me to save Terania Creek. We said, yes, exactly. And he said, look, I'm really sorry to tell you, but that's not my job. My job is to hold this political system stable and stop those bastards in the right wing from getting into power, while you have the opportunity to create the conditions, to create the environment which will allow me to make the kind of moves. There's nothing I would like more than for you to be able to do that. And I just want to say that once you've created the atmosphere where that's a political reality, where that's possible for me to do, nothing would make me happier. And then he showed us to the door, and the stunned media were like, the Premier just spent an hour with these freaks. And he said to his assistant, if they call me, just put the call straight through to me, And the media would say, what did he say? And we said, no comment, and walked away. And it was just like, it was such a beautiful lesson, because that's exactly what happened. 2 years later, 70% of the people of New South Wales wanted an end to rainforest logging, and he was able to do what he was supposed to do, which is the will of the people.
That's a great story. And it's a story about the power of civil society and the recognition by a relatively progressive Premier/governor of the need to comply with it. I have a quick story. My father was Australian. I used to live in Australia. I was once in an airport after Wran had retired as Premier, and there were all sorts of controversies surrounding him, as you will know. And he was going with his wife, Jill Wran, on a different plane, I think. But anyway, we walked into the airport at the same time, and a cleaner came up to Wran and said, Mr. Wran, I'm an immigrant. You always make me feel welcome. And Wran stopped and stood and talked to this guy and listened to him for 20 minutes, with his wife getting more and more anxious about getting on the plane, all the rest of it. I was very struck by that, because there was no political margin for this man in doing this, that he actually did care about working people.
Yeah.
And I think latter history may well judge him more positively than he was judged perhaps when he left office. In any event, John, I wanted to conclude, if I might, by inviting you to add anything you wish to what we've said. There might be something that we've touched on that you want to elaborate upon, or there might be something that we haven't discussed that you want to mention?
Well, I wouldn't mind continuing a little bit with some thoughts that I had just from the last subject that we were looking at, because one of the things that keeps popping into my mind these days is a line from a song by Leonard Cohen. And in that line, Cohen he says, the widowhood of every government. The widowhood of every government. So I think, well, if the government is a widow, who died? And then when I look at the context of that song and other songs that he sang, like one of them is he had a song called "Democracy is Coming to the USA," you know, and it makes me think, well, who died is the citizen. That the citizen died, the government is a widow, and the widow is incapable of withstanding the power and the corruption of the fossil fuel mafia and the Murdoch press and all of those forces of, and that, especially in the United States, there used to be such a strong kind of citizenship. You know, people would go to town halls, people were literate about, what was going on. And so I just wonder how we can okay, so the thing that I like to talk about then, I realise, is that in Australia, last November, a new, very young environmental organisation called Rising Tide organised a blockade of the harbour at Newcastle, a port about an hour and a half north of Sydney, which is the largest coal port in the world, and ships exporting coal out of that port are responsible for over 1% of all of the greenhouse gases in the world. It's quite extraordinary. And so we did a kayak blockade of that port, and more than 3,000 people showed up and 109 got arrested. And I found myself enthusiastic enough to get arrested for the first time in 25 years. And but what excites me about them is that their aim is to create a movement of people, a people's movement. That their aim is to encourage citizenship, to encourage, and so they're working very, very hard to include minorities, to include different nationalities in Australia. And I'm just so excited because anyway, their aim is to have 10,000 people at the blockade in Newcastle in November. And I've started a local hub where I live on the central coast of New South Wales, and I'm starting to go to the monthly market to hand out leaflets, the kind of things that I haven't done for decades because I just love what these young people are doing. And it's not that I have any sense that that it's going to succeed, but I just do remember when another bunch of young people 50 years ago, we did succeed, and it just seems to me that just that they've awakened a very young version of myself, and I'm someone that I haven't seen for a while, and that I'm really pleased to see still exists.
And I think what you've told us there is a wonderful story of regeneration, and that's one of the themes, I think, of your life. IBM, LSD, Rainforest Information Centre, and being open to regeneration, as well as acknowledging that we are these bits of carbon, that we breathe the same air as Julius Caesar and Adolf Hitler breathed, and a lot of other much nicer people. And this is a powerful reminder to those of us listening, specifically in the immediate sense, me, of all those inevitabilities and possibilities. And so, John, I thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's been really terrific.
Thanks, Toby. And I guess I just say that I'm not travelling outside Australia anymore. I've used up all of my carbon budget for lifetimes and lifetimes. But I'm doing a lot of, I'm picking up speed in my work in Australia, to my surprise. And so, you were mentioning that perhaps, 1/8 of your listeners might be Australian. And so I'm particularly interested for them, if they're interested to, know more about my work, for them to get in touch with me, and they can find me easily.
Lovely. Many thanks, John.
Welcome to the Rainforest Information Centre, protecting rainforests in partnership with Indigenous communities and local people to safeguard these vital ecosystems. Join our mission to protect rainforests. Your support makes a difference. Don't miss out on the opportunity to learn more about our work. Help us save the Earth's remaining rainforests. Visit johnseed.net today.
Ecosystem after system is plundered and laid to waste us from the earth. He sucks the life.